You're standing in the middle of nowhere. No roads, no signs, no GPS blinking reassuringly in your pocket. Just grass or forest or open water stretching in every direction, all of it looking exactly the same. And somehow, you need to walk 300 kilometers to a place you've never seen, using directions that were given to you by someone who also never wrote anything down. This was Tuesday for most of human history. We live in a world where getting slightly lost feels like a personal crisis. Your phone dies, you miss one turn, and suddenly you're calling someone in a mild panic. And yet our ancestors regularly crossed entire continents, navigated open ocean out of sight of any land, and found their way back to incredibly specific locations again and again, without a single map, compass, or written coordinate. So how did they actually do it? Because the answer isn't luck. It isn't vague mysticism about primitive instinct either. It's something far more impressive. It's a level of environmental literacy that modern humans have almost completely lost. Let's start with the most jaw-dropping example, because it sets the bar for everything else. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean between islands separated by nothing but water in every direction, with a success rate that still makes modern sailors uncomfortable. No compass, no sextant, no chart, and they weren't getting lucky once. They were doing it as routine, repeatable, teachable navigation, generation after generation. Here's how. They read the stars, but not in the vague, look at the pretty lights way you might imagine. They memorized the exact rising and setting points of specific stars on the horizon, building an entire mental compass out of the sky itself. A star rises in roughly the same spot every night. If you know which star rises due east, you steer toward it. Then swap to the next star as it climbs too high to be useful, then the next. It's called a star path, and skilled navigators held dozens of these star paths in memory at once. But stars are only half the story, and honestly, the ocean reading part is where this gets genuinely uncanny. Polynesian navigators could feel swell patterns through the hull of a canoe. Ocean swells bend and refract around islands the same way sound waves bend around obstacles, and a trained navigator could detect the presence of land, sometimes over 100 kilometers away, purely from subtle changes in how the boat rocked beneath them. They weren't seeing the island. They were feeling its shadow in the water. Add to that, reading cloud formations, since clouds often stack differently over islands due to rising warm air. Watching for specific seabirds that reliably fly out to sea in the morning and back to land at dusk, giving a walking, flying compass needle. Tracking the color and temperature of the water. Every single one of these signals on its own is subtle. Stack a dozen of them together, cross-reference them constantly, and you get a navigation system arguably as reliable as anything electronic, minus the batteries. Now let's come back to land, because the deserts tell an equally wild story. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed something that should honestly be studied in every school as a masterpiece of information design: songlines. A songline is a specific path across the landscape encoded into a song, where the melody, the rhythm, and the lyrics correspond directly to physical features you'll pass along the route. This ridge, then this waterhole, then this rock formation shaped like a particular ancestral figure, then turn here. The song isn't decoration. It's the map. And because it's a song, it's nearly impossible to forget, since melody and rhythm are some of the stickiest things the human memory can hold on to. Some songlines stretch for over 1,000 kilometers, crossing multiple language groups, with each group knowing their specific section, verse by verse, like an oral relay race spanning an entire continent. Think about what that actually means. Instead of folding up a piece of paper, ancient Aboriginal Australians were, in a very real sense, carrying their maps inside their own vocal cords. Meanwhile, in the Arctic, Inuit navigators were solving an entirely different puzzle, because in a flat, white, featureless landscape covered in snow, most of the visual landmarks you'd normally rely on simply don't exist. So they built new ones. Wind consistently blows from certain directions across the Arctic for long stretches of the year, and that wind carves snow into distinctive ridges called sastrugi. An experienced traveler could read the direction and shape of these ridges the way you'd read a street sign, determining which way was north purely from the texture of snow under their sled. They also memorized star positions for the long polar nights and used the subtle color shifts in clouds reflecting off open water versus ice, called ice blink and water sky, to figure out what kind of terrain lay ahead, even when it was still below the horizon. Here's the pattern that's emerging, and it's worth pausing on, because it's the actual answer to the whole question. Ancient humans weren't navigating with one clever trick. They were navigating with dozens of overlapping systems, stitched together into a mental model so dense that losing one signal barely mattered. Lose the stars to cloud cover, you still have the swell. Lose the swell, you still have the birds. It's less like using a single tool and more like running a redundant sensor network, except the sensors were their eyes, ears, skin, and memory. And that leads to something else, something almost uncomfortable to think about. This kind of navigation required a relationship with the environment that most of us today literally cannot access anymore. Not because we're less intelligent, but because we've outsourced the skill. Every single one of us, right now, has the same raw sensory equipment ancient navigators had. Eyes that can detect subtle color shifts, skin that can feel temperature changes in air, ears that could theoretically learn to read wind. The hardware never left. What left was the practice, the apprenticeship, the decades of paying obsessive attention that made those signals meaningful instead of just background noise. Here's a study that puts a fine point on this. Researchers looking at modern GPS use have found something genuinely a little unsettling. Heavy reliance on turn-by-turn navigation appears linked to measurable shrinkage in activity within the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for spatial memory and mental map-making. The very same brain region that ancient navigators were essentially training into a supercomputer every single day of their lives. We're now letting atrophy because a voice tells us to turn left in 400 meters. We didn't just replace the map. We may be quietly reshaping our own brains in the process. So why does any of this matter now, when literally none of us need to cross the Pacific by canoe? Because it says something bigger about what the human brain is actually built for. We assume intelligence looks like books, writing, formulas. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, the most sophisticated information systems we built weren't written down at all. They were sung, felt through a boat hull, read in snow texture, tracked in bird flight patterns, and passed from one generation to the next through memory and apprenticeship rather than ink. That's not primitive. That's a completely different, and in some ways more elegant, operating system for storing and transmitting knowledge. The next time your phone loses signal and that little flicker of panic hits you, standing there disoriented in a place that suddenly seems to have no landmarks at all, remember this. Somewhere, not that long ago on an evolutionary timescale, someone crossed an entire ocean using nothing but starlight, wave patterns, and the flight paths of birds, and they weren't scared at all. Because they were reading a map. You just couldn't see it.